Pilot non-gular status, hands visible.
I am an airline captain, sir. Here are my federal credentials.
Uniform doesn't imply citizenship. We have a report you're illegal.
That is incorrect. I am a U.S. citizen. You can verify this right now.
Stop talking. Turn around. You are being detained.
The security camera at the airport terminal is already recording when the ICE agents step into frame. Fluorescent lights, polished floors, a controlled environment designed for regulated movement and documented decisions. According to the footage, this is not a chaotic scene. It is procedural, measured, official. The man they approach is wearing a uniform jacket, his credentials visible, his posture composed. At that moment, the agents do not know or do not acknowledge that the person in front of them has spent years exercising command authority in one of the most tightly regulated systems in the country. As an airline captain, he has made binding safety determinations mid-flight, enforced federal aviation regulations, and ordered compliance inside a sealed aircraft where hesitation can cost lives. He has grounded planes, diverted routes, removed crew from duty, each action documented, reviewed, and backed by federal standards. The dramatic irony is immediate. The authority in this interaction appears one-sided, but it is not. The footage shows ICE initiating contact as if this were a routine immigration stop. The assumption is implicit in the posture and the phrasing. What the camera captures next is the beginning of a reversal that no one on scene seems prepared for. According to the recording, the captain responds calmly. There is no attempt to flee, no raised voice. His movements remain deliberate. This is a man trained to de-escalate confined space emergencies at 35,000 feet. He has handled in-flight medical crises, coordinated with federal agencies, and executed emergency checklists under time pressure. Those experiences matter here, not as biography, but as evidence of how authority has been exercised by him in the past. The agents proceed anyway. A decision point passes. This was a chance to pause. They do not. As the interaction continues, the camera documents a shift from inquiry to control. Hands move closer. Distance closes. According to the footage, the captain is informed he is being detained. The setting matters. Airports are federal spaces layered with jurisdiction, where mistakes carry amplified consequences. Every step taken here narrows the legal margin. Another decision point arrives. The agents could verify. They could disengage. The footage shows they do neither. The handcuffs come out. Metal clicks shut. The reversal is now complete, though not yet visible to those executing it. A man who has spent his career enforcing compliance for safety reasons is restrained in public, in uniform, inside a terminal designed to record everything. What follows will not hinge on emotion or intent. It will hinge on documentation, on footage, on procedural choices made in sequence. The outcome, measured later in an 8-figure legal judgment, has already been set in motion. The camera does not react. It simply keeps recording. According to the footage and subsequent court filings, the legality of this encounter does not rest on who the man is, but on what the law permits at that location, at that moment, under those conditions. Airports are controlled spaces, but they are not constitutional voids. The Fourth Amendment does not stop at the terminal entrance. The airline captain is present at the airport for a lawful purpose connected to his employment. His access to restricted areas, his movement through security-controlled zones, and his possession of aviation credentials are all governed by federal systems that require verification long before a uniform is issued or a gate is crossed. These systems exist precisely to establish legitimacy in advance, not retroactively after force is applied. The footage shows no attempt by the captain to obscure his identity. There is no evasion, no misrepresentation, no refusal to engage. According to the recording, his responses are direct. His body language remains neutral. He does not escalate. This matters because under established constitutional standards, lawful detention requires more than presence and assumption. It requires reasonable suspicion grounded in articulable facts. Here, the legitimacy gap begins to form. On one side of the interaction is a federal agent operating under immigration enforcement authority. On the other is a U.S. citizen, lawfully present, performing duties tied to interstate commerce and federal aviation regulation. The gap is not about race or motive. It is about process versus presumption. Another decision point passes. According to court documents later reviewed, verification mechanisms were available. Identity confirmation systems existed. Airline employment status could be checked. Citizenship status was not hidden behind layers of secrecy. Each option represented an off-ramp. None were taken. Instead, the interaction narrows. The agents shift from inquiry to restraint. At this stage, the legal threshold rises. Detention without probable cause becomes harder to justify with every passing second. The footage shows time accumulating. Each minute compounds exposure. The captain's legitimacy does not come from his title. It comes from compliance. He complies with instructions. He does not interfere. He does not obstruct. He does not resist. In constitutional analysis, this removes justifications often used to extend or harden enforcement actions. Another decision point. Another chance to stop. They do not. The camera captures the surroundings as well. Travelers move past. Airport personnel observe. This is not a closed interrogation room. It is a public federal space with layered oversight and multiple agencies operating simultaneously. That context increases, not reduces, the expectation that errors will be caught quickly. They are not. As the detention continues, the legality tightens further. According to established precedent, once officers possess, or reasonably should possess, information negating suspicion, continued restraint becomes increasingly difficult to defend. The footage suggests that signals contradicting the initial assumption were present. Credentials, context, conduct, all visible. The legitimacy gap widens. This gap is what later drives the legal analysis, not emotion, not narrative framing, but mismatch. The mismatch between the authority exercised and the authority actually justified under law. Another decision point arrives. The agents could reassess. They could step back. The footage shows continuation. The captain remains handcuffed. His uniform remains visible. The optics are not legally determinative, but they are evidentiary. Public detention inside a secure facility amplifies scrutiny because it leaves a trail. Cameras overlap. Logs accumulate. Witnesses form. At this stage, the interaction is no longer a brief stop. It is a deprivation of liberty. Under constitutional doctrine, that distinction matters. The captain's legitimacy is not something that emerges later. It is present throughout the footage. It is visible in how he speaks, how he stands, how he responds. The law measures legitimacy through conduct, not claims. Yet the enforcement action continues as if none of this exists. This is the core tension that will later be examined in court filings. A lawful individual treated as unlawful through a chain of procedural decisions that never recalibrated. Each decision narrowed flexibility. Each choice increased institutional exposure. By the time the detention ends, the legal outcome has not yet been written, but the framework for it has. The footage does not editorialize. It documents, and what it documents is a widening gap between what the law allowed and what was done. What the footage does not show directly, but what the record later clarifies, is that this encounter did not occur in isolation. It unfolded within a system designed around control, repetition, and procedural momentum. In federal enforcement environments, particularly at transportation hubs, actions are often governed less by individual judgment than by standardized response patterns. According to publicly available operational frameworks, airport enforcement places a premium on continuity. Agents are trained to maintain command presence, limit ambiguity, and avoid perceived loss of control in high-visibility spaces. These priorities are not inherently unlawful, but they carry a structural risk. Once an interaction begins moving in one direction, reversing course becomes institutionally uncomfortable. This is where context matters. The agents involved are operating inside a layered jurisdictional space. Multiple federal agencies, shared authority, overlapping mandates. In such environments, hesitation is often interpreted internally as weakness rather than prudence. The system rewards follow-through. It does not easily reward recalibration. Another decision point passes. The footage suggests that once the initial assumption is made, subsequent actions are shaped to confirm it. This is not framed as intent, it is framed as process. A sequence in which each step justifies the next, even as the original premise weakens. This dynamic is not unique to this case. Internal reviews and court analyses in similar matters have described it as a control and double down pattern. The longer an encounter continues, the harder it becomes for officers to disengage without external prompting. Admitting error mid-interaction can feel, within the system, like surrendering authority. Here, no supervisor intervenes on scene. No external agency steps in to interrupt. The agents continue operating within their immediate chain of command, relying on their own assessment while time accumulates on camera. Another decision point arrives. This was another chance to stop. They didn't. The department context also shapes how information is processed. Verification systems exist, but accessing them requires a pause, a call, a delay. In fast-moving public spaces, delays are often discouraged. According to later filings, this creates a structural bias toward action over confirmation. Action, however, carries legal weight. The airport setting amplifies this. Federal facilities generate records by default. Entry logs, camera overlap, incident reports. Every minute of detention increases the volume of evidence. Every procedural step becomes reviewable after the fact. Yet the system on scene continues as designed. Control is maintained. The subject remains restrained. The interaction progresses deeper into a legal commitment. From a departmental perspective, disengaging now would require acknowledging that the initial premise may have been flawed. That acknowledgement does not align easily with enforcement culture. The footage shows no such recalibration. Another decision point passes. This context does not excuse what happens next. It explains how it becomes possible. Courts later distinguish between individual malice and institutional failure. In this case, the record points toward the latter. The agents do not appear to escalate out of anger or panic. They escalate out of inertia. The system moves forward because it was set in motion. By the time the encounter reaches its later stages, the options have narrowed. Releasing the captain without consequence would raise internal questions. Continuing the detention defers those questions but multiplies external risk. The camera captures none of this internal calculus. It simply records actions, and actions, under law, are what matter. This context will become critical later. Not to assign motive, but to establish foreseeability. The harm did not arise from a single rogue choice. It arose from a sequence of predictable decisions made within a rigid framework. That framework now faces scrutiny. By the time the footage reaches this stage, the interaction has crossed from inquiry into confinement. What began as a stop has hardened into a detention with visible restraints, and each subsequent action now carries constitutional weight. In legal terms, the margin for error has narrowed almost completely. According to the footage, the captain remains compliant. His hands are restrained, his movement controlled, his voice steady. There is no resistance captured on camera. That absence matters because escalation without resistance removes several justifications commonly cited in post-incident reviews. Another decision point arrives. The agents reposition him within the terminal space. The camera angle shifts. Background noise changes. Travelers slow as they pass. This is no longer a transient encounter. It is a sustained deprivation of liberty in a public federal facility. Under Fourth Amendment analysis, duration and intrusiveness are no longer neutral factors. They cut against the detaining authority. The agents could reassess here. Verification remains possible. The detention could be converted into a brief hold pending confirmation. The footage shows neither step being taken. Instead, control is reinforced. At this stage, the legal standard required to justify continued restraint rises. Reasonable suspicion must mature into something closer to probable cause, or the detention must end. The camera records the passage of time. Seconds accumulate. Minutes follow. Each one compounds exposure. Another decision point passes. This was another chance to stop. They didn't. The escalation is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There is no shouting, no physical struggle. The danger here is procedural. The calmness of the scene masks the seriousness of what is unfolding. Courts later pay close attention to such moments because they show deliberation rather than urgency. According to the footage, the agents exchange brief remarks among themselves. Their posture suggests certainty. Certainty, however, is not a substitute for lawful basis. The law does not measure confidence, it measures justification. The captain's credentials remain visible. His uniform remains identifiable. His conduct remains non-threatening. These facts persist across the timeline, unchanged. What changes is the depth of the state's intrusion. Another decision point arrives. The agents choose to maintain the detention and move toward a more controlled area. This choice transforms the encounter again. Movement under restraint is not incidental. It signals an assertion of full custodial authority. At this point, the legal consequences become difficult to unwind. The airport environment magnifies this escalation. Multiple cameras overlap. Entry points log access. Each movement leaves a record. The system that enables enforcement also documents its limits, yet the escalation continues. There is a moment, brief but clear, where the captain pauses. The footage shows a stillness, not resistance, not protest, just a pause. In later analysis, this moment will be noted not for what he does, but for what the agents do next. They proceed. Another decision point passes. The agent's actions now rest on an assumption that has not been substantiated on camera. Continued detention under these conditions increases the risk of constitutional violation with each procedural step. The footage offers no new facts that would justify the deepening restraint. This is the point where the encounter becomes legally asymmetric. The captain has nothing left to give. He has complied fully. The agents, however, continue to take. The escalation reaches its apex not through force, but through persistence. The choice to continue, repeatedly, in the absence of new justification, is itself an action. Courts later treat it as such. By the end of this phase, the reversal hinted at earlier is nearly complete, though still invisible to those enforcing the restraint. The authority exercised here is at its maximum. The legal foundation beneath it is at its weakest. The camera does not intervene. It does not warn. It does not pause. It records. And in doing so, it preserves the precise sequence that will later be examined frame by frame, decision by decision. The review does not begin with conclusions. It begins with timestamps. According to official filings later referenced in court, the first material examined is the footage itself. Security cameras, body-worn cameras, overlapping angles from a federal facility designed to record routine movement and extraordinary events with equal indifference. The evidence does not argue. It presents a sequence. The timeline establishes what cannot be disputed. When the agents initiate contact, when restraints are applied, how long the detention lasts, where the subject is moved, what information is visible at each stage. These are not interpretations, they are data points. Supervisory review follows the footage. At this level, the focus is narrow. Did the agents act within the scope of their authority? Were procedures followed as written? According to the record, this stage does not resolve the matter. Instead, it elevates it. Questions remain unanswered by the initial review, and unanswered questions trigger the next step. Another decision point occurs here, though it happens off camera. The matter moves from immediate supervision to internal review. At this stage, the lens widens. The analysis shifts from individual actions to institutional exposure. Duration, intrusiveness, jurisdiction. The presence of contradictory indicators that were not acted upon. Each element is weighed against established constitutional standards. It is during this phase that the posture changes. There is a moment noted in the record, brief, procedural, and decisive, when the facts stop favoring enforcement and begin favoring liability. No one raises their voice. No statement is made for effect. The air in the room changes anyway. The footage is replayed. This is the silence. No narration. No explanation. Just the image of a uniformed airline captain standing restrained in a public terminal, compliant from start to finish. The sound drops. The posture of those reviewing the footage shifts. Chairs adjust. Screens pause. The authority in the room changes direction. From this point forward, the investigation is no longer about whether the agents acted decisively, it is about whether they acted lawfully. According to court documents, this distinction becomes central. Decisiveness without legal basis carries risk. Documentation transforms that risk into measurable exposure. The review expands outward. Legal counsel becomes involved. City and federal attorneys examine the same footage through a different lens. They are not concerned with intent. They are concerned with defensibility. What could be justified under oath? What could survive cross-examination? What would look reasonable to a jury with access to the same images? Another decision point arrives. At this stage, the investigation is no longer internal in any meaningful sense. The footage exists independently of the agency. It cannot be contained. Requests are made. Records are preserved. The sequence is locked. According to filings, no new facts emerge to justify the prolonged detention. There is no late discovery that retroactively cures the earlier decisions. The evidentiary record stabilizes, and when it does, the outcome narrows. This is how cases turn, not on emotion, not on rhetoric, on whether the documented actions can be reconciled with the law as written and interpreted. Here, the footage does not provide that reconciliation. The silence persists through the review process, not because nothing is happening, but because the critical shift has already occurred. Authority has moved from the field to the record, from agents on scene to attorneys reviewing frame by frame. Once that shift happens, the ending becomes procedural. The investigation does not announce its conclusions dramatically. It simply proceeds to the next phase, where consequences are calculated rather than debated. The legal consequences do not arrive suddenly. They assemble. According to court documents, the first stage is procedural. Claims are filed, jurisdiction is established. The allegations are framed narrowly, anchored to the footage and the timeline already preserved. There is no reliance on speculation. The case advances on what can be shown, not what can be inferred. At this point, the detention is no longer an event. It is an evidentiary record. The lawsuit centers on deprivation of liberty, unlawful detention, and constitutional violations arising from actions taken by federal agents against a U.S. citizen. Each claim traces directly back to a decision point captured on camera. The duration of restraint, the absence of verification, the continuation despite contradictory indicators. These are not argued as isolated mistakes. They are presented as a sequence. Another decision point occurs here. Settlement discussions begin. According to official filings later referenced, the parties evaluate exposure. Attorneys examine comparable verdicts. They assess jury behavior in similar cases. They consider the clarity of the footage, the absence of resistance, the public setting, the professional status of the detained individual, not as a matter of prestige, but as a matter of foreseeability. A uniformed airline captain at an airport is not an ambiguous figure. The numbers begin to form. This phase does not involve public hearings or dramatic courtroom moments. It involves spreadsheets, risk assessments, internal memoranda. Each memo narrows the range of plausible outcomes. Each calculation reflects the same reality. The evidentiary record is difficult to defend. Another decision point passes. According to the record, no fact emerges that materially alters the analysis. There is no hidden justification uncovered in discovery. No missing report that reframes the detention as reasonable. The footage remains the central exhibit, unchanged. As negotiations progress, the figure that ultimately becomes public, $16.2 million, does not represent a single error. It represents accumulated exposure, duration multiplied by visibility, authority exercised without sufficient legal basis, each procedural choice adding weight. The settlement is finalized. It is not framed as an admission of wrongdoing. It does not assign personal blame. It resolves liability. That distinction matters legally, but the consequence is concrete. Funds are allocated. Agreements are executed. The case closes on paper. Another decision point occurs after the settlement. Policy review is triggered. Training protocols are examined. Oversight mechanisms are evaluated. These steps are not punitive. They are corrective. According to the record, they arise because the cost has already been paid. The agents involved are not publicly characterized beyond what filings allow. The system absorbs the outcome. The individual on camera returns to his life with a documented legal judgment, affirming what the footage already showed. The detention was not justified under the law. The $16.2 million figure becomes a reference point, not a headline, but a marker. It appears in risk assessments, in training discussions, in future evaluations of enforcement actions at transportation hubs. This is how consequences function in legal systems. They do not dramatize, they recalibrate. The authority exercised at the airport that day has been weighed, measured, and converted into a number that reflects institutional accountability. Nothing about the process is emotional, it is mechanical, and it is final. The case does not end when the payment clears. In institutional terms, that is when it begins to matter. According to public records and standard post-settlement procedures, the outcome triggers a reassessment of enforcement practices at transportation hubs. Not because of outrage, but because the documentation is now permanent. The footage exists. The timeline is fixed. The legal conclusion has been priced. Training modules are reviewed, not rewritten in haste, but adjusted where the record shows failure points. Verification protocols, duration thresholds, escalation limits. Each is examined against the sequence preserved on camera. The question is not how authority was asserted, but how it was allowed to persist without recalibration. Oversight mechanisms follow. Internal guidance emphasizes what the footage made undeniable. Control without legal foundation is not neutral. It accumulates risk. In public federal spaces, that risk multiplies because documentation is automatic. Cameras do not forget. Logs do not soften. When authority outpaces justification, the record becomes the arbiter. The aftermath is not punitive theater. It is administrative correction. Supervisors are instructed to intervene earlier. Agents are reminded that verification is not a concession, but a safeguard. Pausing is reframed not as weakness, but as compliance with constitutional boundaries. The system absorbs the lesson quietly. The airline captain's case becomes a reference, not by name, but by structure. A lawful individual, a public detention, a visible sequence of decisions, an 8-figure resolution. In training rooms and policy briefings, those elements form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. This is how institutional memory is built. No statement is required to assign meaning. The footage already has. It shows how authority can invert itself when unchecked, and how the law responds, not with rhetoric, but with consequence. The final recalibration is subtle. Agents continue their work. Airports remain controlled environments. Enforcement continues. What changes is the margin, the space where verification must occur, the moment where escalation must stop. The law does not demand perfection, it demands reasonableness. In this case, the record showed where reasonableness ended. The camera did not accuse, it documented. And that documentation reshaped policy more effectively than any speech or directive could. That is the lasting effect.